Welcome to Stories from the Breakroom, where the real stories of work come to life.
Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of Stories from the Breakroom, the podcast. I am Nora Burns. I will be your host and your guide on this adventure, and I am so thankful that you're here. Now, this podcast is dependent on your stories. If you are a worker in America who is not an executive, an owner, or an independent contractor, I would love to hear your workplace stories. What's going great? What's good? What's bad? And what is ugly in the American workforce today? You can submit your stories online at storiesfromthebreakroom.com, or you can call them in to our telephone line, which is a 5-minute recorded voicemail. And it's 719, that's Colorado Springs number, in case you're wondering, Colorado Springs, Colorado, 719-886 6672 is that phone line. And we will protect your confidentiality, as you will see an example of that today in sharing a story that came in over the course of the last couple of days. Now, I clearly struck a chord on episode 3 in talking about leaves of absence from work. And there's a wide variety of reasons that you might take a leave of absence from work. Bereavement leave, jury duty, military leave, to care for your health or the health of someone else, because it's an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's a wide variety of reasons that you might need to take a leave of absence from work. And apparently, we're not always handling those well, because we received a lot of stories after episode 3 aired with additional examples on leave of absence, handled poorly and handled well. There's one story in particular that I would like to share with you today and for us to talk about. First, I need to give you a little bit of background. So I use a particular turn of phrase to talk about those times when life just gives you a negative event, a negative event, a negative event, one right after the other. Now, it seems that this happens to most people at some point in their life. And so I refer to this time in your life as your country music song year. Now, I know, I'm sorry, Dolly and Taylor and Willie, all of the country music song greats. I'm sorry, but it works. Because most of you have heard the old joke about country music songs. Do you know it? What do you get when you play a country music song backwards? Get your dog back, you get your house back, you get your spouse back. I know. And this relates to when the country music songs were really, it's probably more 1970s when I was growing up listening to country music songs. But it just seemed like there was always one bad thing that was happening right after another. So if you're not familiar about what I'm talking about by saying country music song year, I want you to just hang on, because it just seems everybody gets one at some point in their life. This country music song year concept came up for me initially in probably 1999 when I had a colleague who was going through this. But for me, my country music song year was 2006. And let me tell you, country music song year, here's an example. Inside of 6 months, my mom had emergency open heart surgery. My father-in-law had surgery. My mother-in-law had some health issues. I had to put down the dog that I'd had since college. I found out that my husband was cheating on me, filed for a divorce from that husband, and my father died. Inside of 6 months. Oof. That's what I mean by a country music song year, where there's just these life events that come boom, boom, one right after the other, even though they're not related to one another. Well, 2 of those were related, but you know what I mean. The thing is how we navigate our relationships and how we look out for our friends and our community members and our employees and colleagues during their country music song year, that's critical to the bonding of the relationship and to what the story is that they tell about our relationship with them. And I'll tell you what the very first of those things that happened in that whole series in 2006. The first one was when my mom went in for emergency open heart surgery. I can still see my office from that day. And I hung up the phone, the office phone, from talking to one of my siblings when they gave me the information about Mom, what was happening, and the fact that she was going to have to go in for surgery. I was at a point where I had this big project happening at work. And I was working with a colleague by the name of Dave. And Dave and I were colleagues. We did not report one to the other, but we had been in the trenches on this project. We were completely reinventing the leadership development of our organization. And we were pitching a big investment by the organization into leadership development. And we were only, I think, 3 days away from giving that presentation when this call came in. It was a big deal. And we had a lot of hours into prepping for it. And I hung up the phone in my office and I came around the corner and I almost ran right into Dave. He was coming to my office to talk to me about something having to do with this project. He took one look at my face and said, "What happened?" And at first I tried to just shy away from that discussion and focus back on work. And he said, No, what happened? And I told him that my mom was going in for emergency open heart surgery. Now, Dave knew that my mom was very important to me and that we had a very close relationship. And he said, he didn't hesitate. And he said, "What time's your flight?" And I said, "What? I'm not booking a flight." I'm like, "My siblings will take care of it. We've got this important project." You can tell that I wasn't really great at work-life balance at this particular point in my life. But I said, he said, "I've got this. We've done the groundwork. It's okay. It's okay. I can do a little bit extra work for the next couple of days so you can go be with your mom. Go book your flight." I will never forget that support. I was so incredibly thankful for that support. Now, he wasn't my boss, but when I went to my boss, we had a similar conversation and we explained that Dave was going to handle the presentation. And P.S., we did get the funding. But I was so thankful. And I had no idea that that was the very beginning of a country music song year, that was the first thing that was going to happen in quick succession over the course of 6 months. And just imagine if that first moment, if the first thing had been handled so poorly by the organization, if they had not handled that first thing well, if I hadn't gotten love and support and kindness shown to me for that first element, imagine what my expectation would have been as thing after thing after thing after thing came flying at me. We cement our relationships. We build those relationships in times of trauma when people really need our love and care. But in case you weren't familiar with the fact that I use country music song year to describe those times in our lives when we go through a whole bunch of tumultuous events, one right after the other, that's what I mean by country music song year. Now, if we have built up a really strong community around us, we've been there for our colleagues, it is a lot easier to navigate those times. Now, this is something I talk about a lot when we talk about emotional intelligence. If you are not yet familiar with the concept of emotional intelligence, I would recommend a particular resource. This is the book that I use. It's called The EQ Edge, and the authors are Book and Stein. It's Stephen Stein and Howard Book. I have no relationship with these two people. I've never met them. If you know them, I would totally love an introduction. But The EQ Edge is the book that I recommend about emotional intelligence. Telling you, if you address some of these elements of emotional intelligence, A, you're going to be a stronger leader, guaranteed. And B, you'll be a better colleague. And C, you're going to be in better shape when that country music song comes rolling around. Because one of the elements of emotional intelligence has to do with stress and stress management. Now, the cool thing I love about this book, because if you go into Amazon or you go to the Tattered Cover website, Tattered Cover is a local bookstore here in Denver that I love and adore. So if you go to your local bookstore and you look up emotional intelligence, you're going to get hundreds, if not thousands, of recommendations and responses in terms of book on emotional intelligence. Some of them are incredibly well written and some of them are crap. So I'm just going to give you this recommendation right away. The thing that I love about the EQ Edge is that you can read the first 2 chapters. Yeah. After the first 2 chapters, it goes into each of the elements of emotional intelligence. So you can get the baseline understanding about how the book's laid out, and then you can skip to the element that you think is most important for you right now. So chapter 14 is on impulse control. And I just think it's funny if you skip to that chapter. I have a weird sense of humor, I know. But the other cool thing about this particular resource is at the end of the chapter that talks to you about that element of emotional intelligence, it gives you exercises to do that you can do on your own. There's a lot of journaling. Just go ahead and buy a journal while you're buying this book. So the EQ Edge, if you're concerned about a country music song year, if you want to be supportive of those who are going through an emotional country music song year, working on your emotional intelligence is significant. We will talk about emotional intelligence on more than one occasion, I have no doubt. But as we talk about country music song year, I want to share with you the story that was submitted, one of the many stories that was submitted over the past couple of days since we aired episode 3 that talked about leave of absence. Now, I have read this story multiple times, and I'm still not convinced that I'm going to get through it on the first try, because it is an incredibly emotional story. So FYI, if you are listening to this and you're not in a frame of reference where you can hear about somebody going through a particularly challenging point in their life, I would recommend pausing this and coming back to it at a later time. Because this story is very emotional and moving, and includes some trauma elements to it. So, giving you that warning now. As I mentioned in the other episodes, and I will continue to remind you, I will always protect the confidentiality of the people who call in and write in with their stories. I will also protect the confidentiality of the organizations, because it's not about blame and shame. It's not about pointing fingers to any one organization, but it is getting an overall understanding of our trends in the American workplace and what we can do better as colleagues, as leaders, and how we can improve. So you will notice that I'm going to bleep out the name of the business that she lists. I'm going to try to stay as true to this write-up as possible. So here we go. Before my current job, I worked at bleep, major Fortune 500 company. That wasn't a great experience. While I worked there, my dad died. And when I was off on bereavement leave, I would get calls asking me questions about work and also asking me to answer questions and turn in my payroll and vacation time. It was just awful. But really, my country music song year started in the first 11 months of my current job. First, I had a cancer scare. I went to my new boss and she sat down and listened to me as I spoke about how absolutely terrified I was. But then my diagnosis was changed. And in an unexpected turn, I didn't have a risk of cancer, but I was diabetic. All of the appointments that I needed to work through this and manage it required me to work remotely for a period of time. These were attended to, and she helped me and she checked in with me, not in a way of bothering me about work things while I was on leave, but rather just making sure that I was okay. And then my worst nightmare happened. I was back at work and I miscarried while at the office, crying, scared, and bleeding. But my boss jumped into action. She drove me to the hospital and then stayed with me until my husband arrived. The following days, she told me, just stay home, take care of yourself. But I was so overwhelmed with grief, I couldn't sit at home by myself. She allowed me to come in to work, knowing that being busy was exactly what I needed. But she kept a very close eye on me. When I did come back to the office full time, she made sure that my desk was cleaned, my office was completely cleaned up, and there was no sign of what had happened. And no one spoke of what had happened. They only showed me love and support as I continued to heal. I'm so very grateful for her. And I feel that she truly cares about her team. I will never forget it. I am so incredibly thankful that this listener was at this employer when this happened and not at the previous employer who had already demonstrated an inability to separate that work from leave time. Because going through this kind of loss is so challenging. And I can't imagine having something like that happen at the office. I am so thankful this is who she was working with when this happened, and that this was a story of love and support and an employer that did it right. Now, I know that there's some of you who are in HR and other areas of operations that are thinking, don't drive the employee to the hospital yourself. That's a huge liability. No, I don't know where this person was at this time. They could have been in a very rural setting where waiting for an ambulance simply wasn't an option. And in that case, I'm incredibly thankful they took the initiative. And I know I'm aware of risk assessment, but this was what you do for a friend. So I want you to think about that story by comparison to some that you have heard where the leave of absence wasn't honored or people didn't show care and support, and how powerful it is that she had a boss who was looking out for her. Now, she was at the start of a country music song year, and just like with mine, her very first point, the very first time something happened in that series of events that happened in quick succession, she was shown love and support. And that set the tone for an organization that was going to look out for her throughout this pathway. Now, it happens. I know that early in my career, when people would have multiple things happen time and time again, right after I just thought, oh, they're just coming up with stuff. Woof. And then as you age, you realize that people have country music song years, and we have to love and appreciate them throughout it. If you prepare yourself now with elements of emotional intelligence, your country music song year will not be as bumpy as it could be. I'm not promising it's going to be smooth, guaranteed. But if you develop the relationships, you build the connections, you have some stress management, you're aware of your own emotional competencies, it will help. And if you are a leader in an organization, and you develop really strong emotional intelligence skills, promise you, you'll be a stronger leader. Now, in the future, we're going to talk about a variety of different aspects of work. We just happen to have I really just hit the nail on the head, apparently, with talking about leave of absence. And we had a whole lot of people who gave us stories about leave of absence. But in future episodes, I'm talking to some experts to come on and talk with us about things like wage and hour issues. Have you ever been asked to punch out and then continue to work? Or been told that your overtime, your 10 hours of overtime from this week will actually just carry into next week so you can take 10 hours off next week? P.S. Don't do that. It's a violation. But if it's happened to you, want to hear about it. Are you a tipped employee who your tips don't seem to make up the difference between your tipped minimum wage and the stated minimum wage? We're going to talk about wage and hour issues. I'm talking with an expert about that now. Also would love to hear your stories about that. The other hot spot that we're working with an expert on is retail loss prevention. If you have worked in a retail setting, you know that there's loss prevention mechanisms that are put into place. Some to protect the employer from being ripped off by customers who come in or vendors who come in, and some that are directed at preventing employee theft. Some of those work really well. Some of those feel like an intrusion into the employee's life. I'd love to hear your stories about where it's handled really, really well and where it's not. And we're going to talk to some experts on those topics. Please keep your stories coming in. Your stories will build the fabric of this podcast and will determine what topics we cover on a go-forward basis. What are the things you'll talk to your colleagues about, but maybe you don't talk to your boss about? What are the things you don't want to put on that employee survey because you're afraid it might get traced back to you? This is a safe space because I will continue to protect confidentiality of the people who call in stories and write in stories. I've never disclosed the names of the organizations where I worked as the undercover employee. I get asked that question a lot. But it's not about blame and shame. It's about what are the trends? How can we collectively get better as employees, as colleagues, and as leaders? I'm Nora Burns, and this has been Stories from the Breakroom. I look forward to future episodes with you. Please keep your stories rolling in. I'll see you next week.